Imagine you are outnumbered, outgunned. Your ship is on fire. Water is flooding the lower decks. Your crew is dying around you, and the enemy commander is screaming across the dark ocean, demanding that you surrender. Every rational calculation says it is over. Every instinct of survival says give up. And then, from somewhere deep inside a man who was born with almost nothing, who rose from the docks of Scotland to command the most feared warship on the Atlantic, comes a voice that cuts through the smoke and the fire and the chaos. And that voice says something that no one in that moment could possibly believe. Something so audacious, so defiant, so completely insane given the circumstances, that it would echo through centuries of military history and become the defining statement of what it means to refuse to quit. That voice belonged to John Paul Jones, and what he said in that moment, on the night of September 23, 1779, somewhere in the dark waters off the coast of England, was this: "I have not yet begun to fight." That single sentence. That one declaration made in the middle of one of the most desperate naval engagements in the history of warfare would travel across time and across oceans and across generations to become the heartbeat of an entire nation's identity. But here is what most people do not know. The real story, the full story, the story of the man behind that line, is so much more extraordinary than the quote itself. It is a story of poverty and ambition and murder and reinvention and genius and obsession and betrayal and glory. It is a story that begins not on the deck of a warship, but in a tiny stone cottage in rural Scotland, where a gardener's son looked out at the horizon and decided that the world was not big enough to contain what he felt burning inside him. John Paul was born on July 6, 1747, in a small village called Arbigland in Kirkbean, Scotland. His father, John Paul Sr., was a gardener who worked on the estate of William Craik, a wealthy landowner. His mother was Jean Macduff. They were not poor in the crushing sense, but they were working class, entirely dependent on the goodwill of the aristocracy that owned the land they lived on. The cottage where John Paul was born still stands today, a modest stone building that looks out over the Solway Firth, and if you stand in front of it and look toward the water, you begin to understand something essential about this man. The sea was always there. It was always visible from his earliest moments of consciousness, and it seems to have called to him the way a flame calls to a moth, with an intensity that was both irresistible and dangerous. From his very earliest years, John Paul was different from the other children in his village. He was restless in a way that made the adults around him uncomfortable. He was sharp, almost unnervingly perceptive, with a memory that could hold details that other people let slide through their minds. He was also proud, in a way that did not quite fit his station in life. The sons of gardeners in 18th century Scotland were not supposed to have pride. They were not supposed to look at the sons of the gentry and feel anything other than deference. But John Paul looked at the world with different eyes, and what he saw was not the ceiling that his birth had placed above him. What he saw was the sea, and the ships that moved across it, and the possibility that a man with enough skill and enough daring could go anywhere. He was 13 years old when he signed his first articles as a ship's boy. 13. Let that sink in for a moment. At an age when most of us were still figuring out how to navigate the halls of middle school, John Paul was learning to navigate the Atlantic Ocean. His first employer was a Whitehaven merchant named John Younger, and the vessel he sailed on was a ship called the Friendship. The name is almost comedically ironic, given the life of conflict that this boy would grow into. But in those early years, the sea was genuinely a friend to him. It was the one place where his intelligence and his energy and his relentless drive had room to breathe. On land, he was constrained by class and convention. On the water, the only thing that mattered was how good you were, and John Paul was very, very good. He learned navigation with a speed that astonished his superiors. He absorbed everything: the mathematics of celestial navigation, the art of reading weather patterns, the complex choreography of managing a crew, the physics of wind and sail and current that determined whether a ship arrived at its destination or ended up at the bottom of the ocean. By the time he was in his late teens, he was already being noticed by men who had been sailing for decades. There was something in this young Scotsman that set him apart, a combination of technical brilliance and almost frightening intensity that made him both admirable and a little unsettling to be around. But the sea also brought him into contact with one of the darkest aspects of the 18th century world. John Paul sailed extensively in the slave trade, making voyages between Britain, the West African coast, and the Caribbean. He was not a slave trader himself in the sense of owning the enterprise, but he sailed on ships that carried enslaved human beings across the Atlantic, and he was part of that machinery. This is a part of his story that many of his admirers have preferred to gloss over, but it is important to confront it honestly, because it is part of the full picture of who he was. He was a man of his time in certain respects, and the slave trade was legal and normalized in the British Empire of the 1760s, though it was also increasingly contested by abolitionists. What we know is that he eventually left that trade, later in his life expressing opposition to it. But the years he spent sailing those routes shaped him, hardened him, and exposed him to levels of human cruelty that most people in his social world would never witness. By 1768, John Paul had shown enough skill to be given his first command. He was made master of a brigantine called the John, sailing between Scotland and the Caribbean. He was 21 years old. The responsibility of commanding a vessel, of being responsible for the safety of a crew and the delivery of a cargo across unpredictable and dangerous ocean waters, would have been overwhelming for most men that age. For John Paul, it seems to have been the natural state he had always been moving toward. He was a disciplinarian, demanding of himself and demanding of his crew, which was not unusual for ship captains of the era, but he was also fair in ways that distinguished him from some of his contemporaries. He believed that a crew that was treated with a baseline of dignity performed better than one that was ruled purely by fear. And then came the first of the great crises that would define his life. In 1770, on a voyage to the West Indies, John Paul's ship's carpenter, a man named Mungo Maxwell, died. The circumstances were disputed. John Paul had ordered Maxwell flogged for what he described as gross insolence and a refusal to perform his duties. Whether the flogging was excessive, whether Maxwell's subsequent death was directly caused by the punishment, became the subject of a heated dispute. Maxwell's father accused John Paul of murder. John Paul was arrested in Tobago, but was eventually released when a court found insufficient evidence to hold him. He returned to Scotland and was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing by the Vice Admiralty Court. But the episode left a stain on his reputation, and more importantly, it revealed something about him, a streak of severity, of rigidity around matters of discipline and authority that would cause him serious trouble again. The second crisis was worse. It occurred in 1773 in Tobago, a place that seemed fated to be his nemesis. John Paul was commanding a merchant vessel called the Betsy, and he was engaged in a dispute with his crew over wages. The details of exactly what happened are not entirely clear, because the surviving accounts are partial and contradictory. But what is clear is that a confrontation occurred between John Paul and a member of his crew, a large and violent man whose identity has been obscured by history, sometimes referred to simply as the ringleader. According to John Paul's own account, this man attacked him with a weapon, and John Paul, in self-defense, drew his sword and killed him. Now, whether this was truly self-defense or something more calculated is something historians have debated for 2.5 centuries. What is undeniable is that John Paul, facing the prospect of being tried for murder in a hostile jurisdiction where the victim had local sympathies and where he feared he could not get a fair hearing, made a decision. He ran. He abandoned his ship, his cargo, and his identity. He disappeared into the Caribbean. And when he eventually emerged on the other side of the Atlantic, he was no longer John Paul. He had added a surname that he would carry for the rest of his life. He became John Paul Jones. The choice of Jones was deliberate. It was the most anonymous name he could find, a common surname that would not draw attention, that would not connect him to the events in Tobago. He later claimed that friends had sheltered him and helped him establish a new identity, and he made vague references to a brother who had settled in Virginia, which gave him a plausible story for his presence in the American colonies. Whatever the full truth of his escape, by the mid-1770s John Paul Jones was living in Virginia, presenting himself as a gentleman of some means, and watching with intense interest as the political situation between Britain and its American colonies deteriorated toward the point of no return. When the American Revolution began in 1775, John Paul Jones saw it with perfect clarity for what it was: an opportunity. Not cynically, not purely for personal advancement, though that was certainly part of it, but genuinely. He had spent his entire adult life serving the British Empire, an empire that had given him opportunities but that had also constrained him, that had judged him by his birth and his lack of social connections, that had left him vulnerable to the whims of merchants and local courts. America was something different. America was, at least in its ideals, a place where a man could be judged by what he could do rather than by who his father was. John Paul Jones believed in the American cause with a passion that sometimes surprised even those who knew him well. He presented himself to the Continental Congress and to the men who were trying to build an American Navy from essentially nothing, and what he brought to them was extraordinary. Here was a man with more actual deep water sailing experience than almost anyone available to the new nation. Here was a man who had commanded ships across the Atlantic and the Caribbean, who understood navigation and tactics and crew management, and the complex logistics of operating a vessel far from any support base. The Continental Navy needed men like him desperately, and they recognized it. He received his first commission in the Continental Navy in December of 1775. He was given the rank of first lieutenant aboard the Alfred, the flagship of the small fleet that Commodore Essex Hopkins was assembling in the Delaware River. The early months of his service were characterized by the kind of frustration that would follow him throughout his career, a gap between what he could see that needed to be done and the resources and authority he was given to do it. He was capable of commanding a major operation, and he was being used as a subordinate officer on a modestly sized vessel. He was patient, because he had to be, but patience was not naturally in his temperament. His first significant independent command came with the Providence, a small sloop that he was given in the summer of 1776. And on the Providence, John Paul Jones began to show the world what he could do when he had the freedom to operate according to his own judgment. He was a raider, an audacious and tactically brilliant raider, who struck British shipping with a speed and ferocity that made him both feared and infuriating to British commanders. In a series of operations that summer and fall, he took or destroyed multiple British vessels, disrupted supply lines, and demonstrated a capacity for independent strategic thinking that went far beyond the simple execution of orders. He understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. The Continental Navy could not defeat the Royal Navy in a straightforward battle. The disparity in resources was simply too great. What the Americans could do was hurt the British, embarrass them, disrupt their commerce, threaten their coastline, force them to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive ones, and above all, demonstrate to the world, to France and Spain and the Netherlands, and all the other powers watching this conflict with interest, that America was not just a collection of ragged colonists with muskets, but a force to be reckoned with on the seas as well as the land. This strategic vision would culminate in one of the most audacious raids in naval history, an operation that Jones conceived and executed in April of 1778 against the British port of Whitehaven. Whitehaven, on the northwest coast of England. Not a raid on a British ship in American waters, not an engagement somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, an attack on a port town on the coast of Britain itself. This was the kind of thing that simply did not happen. The British had not faced an enemy raid on their own coastline in more than a century. The very idea of it seemed absurd, like an attack on the homeland, and that was precisely why Jones wanted to do it. He was commanding the Ranger, an 18-gun sloop, and he led a small party of men ashore in the early morning hours of April 22, 1778. The raid was not a complete military success. Some of his men visited a tavern instead of executing their assigned tasks, which delayed operations and gave the town time to respond. The British cannon Jones's party attempted to spike were not all effectively disabled. The ship he intended to burn in the harbor was slow to catch fire and was eventually saved. By military standards of the time, it was a mixed result, but that completely misses the point. The point was that it happened at all. The point was that the morning after the raid, the people of Britain woke up to the news that an American naval officer had attacked a British port on British soil. The psychological impact was seismic. If this could happen in Whitehaven, it could happen anywhere. Suddenly, British coastal towns that had never imagined themselves to be in any danger were petitioning for defenses, for warships to patrol their waters. Resources that the British needed for offensive operations against America were being diverted to protect the home islands against a single man in a single ship. That is strategic genius. That is understanding what war is really about, which is not just killing but convincing, not just destroying but demoralizing. Later that same day, Jones sailed to the Scottish coast and attempted to kidnap the Earl of Selkirk from his estate on St. Mary's Isle. The intention was to hold the Earl hostage to secure the release of American prisoners being held in British jails. The Earl was not at home, and the operation failed in its objective. But the raid on his estate sent shockwaves through the British aristocracy. If Jones could strike at a nobleman's home on the Scottish coast, nowhere was safe. Jones, showing a side of himself that complicated the simple narrative of the ruthless raider, later purchased the silver that his crew had taken from the Selkirk estate and returned it to Lady Selkirk with a letter of apology. He was fighting a war, but he was also conducting something like a public relations campaign, presenting himself as an honorable officer rather than a pirate. 2 days later, on April 24th, he fought the Drake, a Royal Navy sloop of war, in a sharp engagement in Belfast Lough. The battle lasted just over an hour. The Drake was battered into submission, and Jones brought her back as a prize. It was the first Royal Navy warship to be captured by a vessel flying American colors in European waters. The symbolic importance was enormous, but all of these actions, significant as they were building toward something bigger. Something that would define not just John Paul Jones, but an entire idea of what American military identity could look like. To understand what came next, you need to understand the political and diplomatic context, because the Battle of Flamborough Head did not happen in isolation. It happened because of a complex web of alliances and negotiations that had been building since France formally entered the war on the American side in early 1778. The French alliance changed everything for the American cause. Suddenly, America had access to French naval resources, French ports, French military advisors, and French diplomatic weight. For John Paul Jones, it meant something very specific. It meant the possibility of commanding a real squadron, a force capable of doing more than raiding. He spent months in France, navigating the courts of Versailles with surprising skill for a Scottish gardener's son, charming French officials and aristocrats, impressing Benjamin Franklin, who was serving as America's ambassador to France, and who became one of Jones's most important advocates. What he eventually received was far from what he had asked for. He had wanted a powerful frigate, a purpose-built warship capable of taking on anything the Royal Navy had. What he got instead was a converted French merchant ship called the Duras, which had been built to carry cargo, not to fight. She was slow and old and cramped, and she had been modified to carry guns, but the modifications were imperfect. Jones renamed her the Bonhomme Richard, which translates roughly as Poor Richard, a tribute to Benjamin Franklin's famous almanac. The name was almost self-deprecating, a nod to the reality that this ship was not what anyone would have chosen for the mission ahead. He assembled a squadron around the Bonhomme Richard. It included the Alliance, a genuine American-built frigate commanded by a volatile French officer named Pierre Landais, who would prove to be one of the most infuriating elements of the entire campaign. There were also several smaller French vessels under Jones's nominal command. I say nominal because the command structure was deeply complicated by the fact that some of his ships were French naval vessels, and their officers did not always accept Jones's authority without question. The squadron set out in August of 1779 on a cruise that would take them around the British Isles, creating havoc, taking prizes, disrupting British shipping. For the British, it was a nightmare. A hostile force was literally sailing around their home islands, within sight of their coastline, seemingly invulnerable. The political pressure on the British government was intense. And then, on the afternoon of September 23, 1779, off Flamborough Head on the Yorkshire coast of England, the situation changed. Jones's lookouts spotted a convoy of merchant ships, 41 vessels loaded with naval stores from the Baltic, escorted by 2 Royal Navy warships. The larger of the 2 escorts was the Serapis, a brand new copper-bottomed frigate of 50 guns, one of the most modern and powerful ships the Royal Navy had. Her captain was Richard Pearson, an experienced and competent officer. The Bonhomme Richard was already in a desperate position before the battle began. She was old and slow, and her guns were unreliable. In fact, 2 of her largest guns would explode during the opening exchanges of the battle, killing their own crews and blowing a massive hole in her own deck. She had perhaps 300 men aboard, a mixed force of Americans, French, British, Portuguese, Scandinavian, and other nationalities, one of the most multinational crews in the history of naval warfare. The battle began in the early evening light, around 7 o'clock, as the sun was beginning to descend. The 2 ships maneuvered, each captain trying to gain an advantageous position. Richard Pearson was methodical and confident. He had a superior ship. The mathematics of the situation told him that if he simply maintained his position and kept fighting, the Bonhomme Richard would eventually be destroyed. He was probably right. The opening broadside of the Serapis was devastating. The Bonhomme Richard shuddered under the impact. Guns were dismounted. Men were killed. The 2 exploding guns made the situation even worse. Within the first minutes of engagement, Jones knew that his ship was badly damaged and that he could not win a conventional artillery duel. The Serapis's guns were more numerous, more reliable, and fired faster than his own. Every minute that passed in a standoff engagement was a minute that brought the Bonhomme Richard closer to the bottom. So Jones made a decision that was either the most brilliant tactical choice of the battle or the most desperate gamble of his career, and it was probably both. He brought his ship alongside the Serapis and lashed them together. The 2 ships were bound to each other, unable to separate, unable to maneuver. From that moment, the battle became something medieval, something that belonged more to the age of galleys and boarding parties than to the age of modern naval artillery. Men fought hand to hand on the decks. Musketeers fired from the rigging into the deck below. Grenades were thrown through open gun ports. The Bonhomme Richard was literally sinking. Water was flooding into her hold. Her hull had been breached in multiple places by the Serapis's guns. Fire was burning in several locations below decks. The situation was, by any objective measure, hopeless. And it was at this moment, somewhere in the hours of darkness, the battle had been going on for hours by now, with both ships locked together and burning, that Richard Pearson called out to Jones and asked him if he had struck his colors, meaning had he lowered his flag, had he surrendered. The answer that came back across the smoke and the fire and the sounds of men dying is the answer that has lived for almost 2.5 centuries. I have not yet begun to fight. The exact words, as they have come down to us, are probably a reconstruction. No one was transcribing the exchange in that moment. What we have are accounts written down afterward by men who were there, and the specific phrasing "I have not yet begun to fight" appears in accounts written years after the battle. What Jones may actually have said in the heat of the moment might have been something slightly different. Perhaps I may sink, but I'll be damned if I strike, which appears in some earlier accounts. But the meaning was identical, whatever the precise words. The meaning was, no, never. Not while I still breathe. And then, against everything that logic and mathematics and the weight of evidence said was possible, John Paul Jones began to win. His crew, inspired by their commander's absolute refusal to accept defeat, fought with a ferocity that transformed the tactical situation. A French grenadier, climbing in the rigging of the Bonhomme Richard, threw a grenade through an open gun port of the Serapis, and it landed among a row of powder cartridges that had been laid out on the lower deck of the British ship. The resulting explosion killed or wounded somewhere around 40 men, and effectively silenced the main battery of the Serapis for a critical period, with the lower deck guns of the Serapis temporarily out of action, and with the Bonhomme Richard's crew throwing grenades and firing down through the hatches and fighting with every weapon available, including their bare hands. The balance began to shift. Richard Pearson, seeing his crew devastated, his lower deck in shambles, and the situation deteriorating despite his ship being technically superior, made the decision that Jones had refused to make. He struck his colors. He surrendered. The Serapis was taken, but the Bonhomme Richard, the ship Jones had just won the greatest naval battle of his life aboard, could not be saved. She was too badly damaged. She was flooded past the point of recovery. Jones transferred his flag to the captured Serapis and watched as the Bonhomme Richard, the ship he had named for Benjamin Franklin's almanac, the old converted merchant vessel that had no business fighting a modern Royal Navy frigate and had somehow done it anyway, slipped beneath the surface of the North Sea. He was devastated. He had taken the enemy ship, but lost his own. More importantly, he had lost men. He had lost men he knew, men he had sailed with, men who had died because of decisions he had made. Jones never spoke of his victories with uncomplicated triumph. The cost was always present in his consciousness. He was not a man who celebrated war. He conducted it with relentless determination, but he was not blind to what it cost. The news of the battle reached Europe and America like a thunderclap. The American cause needed heroes desperately. It needed stories that could counter the narrative of an impossible struggle against an unbeatable empire. And here was the story to end all stories. Here was John Paul Jones, outnumbered, outgunned, his ship literally sinking beneath him, and he had refused to surrender, and he had won. The story spread faster than any official communication could have carried it. People talked about it in coffee houses and on street corners and in the halls of the Continental Congress. Louis XVI of France, whose alliance with America was still relatively new, received Jones at Versailles and personally decorated him. Benjamin Franklin, who was not easily impressed, wrote of Jones with genuine admiration. The Continental Congress voted him a gold medal, one of the first ever struck to honor an American officer. In Britain, the reaction was a mixture of outrage and grudging respect. Richard Pearson, the captain who had surrendered, was actually court-martialed, as was standard procedure when a British naval officer lost his ship. But he was honorably acquitted when the court determined that he had fought his ship to the absolute limit of what was possible against an opponent who simply refused to behave rationally. Jones spent the remaining years of the Revolutionary War in a state of considerable frustration. He was famous, he was celebrated, but he could not get the ships he wanted. The Continental Navy was perpetually short of resources, perpetually dependent on French cooperation that was itself subject to French strategic priorities that did not always align with American ones. He made another cruise to British waters in 1781, commanding the Ariel, but it did not produce anything comparable to his earlier exploits. The war was winding down in any case, with the decisive French naval victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake in September of 1781, and then the British surrender at Yorktown in October of the same year, effectively ending major military operations. The peace treaty was signed in 1783, and with it, the Continental Navy was essentially dissolved. There was no money to maintain it, and there were serious debates in the new country about whether a standing naval force was even appropriate for a republic. John Paul Jones found himself without a command, without an income, and without a clear future in the country he had served so brilliantly. He returned to France, partly because he was owed prize money that was tied up in French courts, partly because he was more celebrated there than in America, and partly because he had no obvious place to go. The mid-1780s were years of considerable difficulty for him. He was in his late 30s, famous but not wealthy, living in Paris on money he did not really have, pursuing the legal claims that he believed were owed to him and his crew from the capture of the Serapis and other prizes. He was a man between worlds, not entirely French, not entirely American, not any longer British, and not young enough to wait indefinitely for the right opportunity to come along. That opportunity came from an unexpected direction. In 1788, Catherine the Great of Russia invited him to take a commission as a rear admiral in the Imperial Russian Navy. Catherine was at war with the Ottoman Empire, fighting over control of the Black Sea region, and she needed experienced naval commanders. She had heard of Jones's reputation and she wanted him. Jones accepted. His time in Russian service was, to put it gently, difficult. He served in the Battle of Liman in 1788, a major engagement against the Ottoman fleet in the waters near the mouth of the Dnieper River. By some accounts, he fought brilliantly, contributing significantly to the Russian victory. But he was immediately embroiled in the same kinds of political and personal conflicts that had plagued his career in American service. Russian naval officers resented him, jealous of his reputation and suspicious of a foreigner being elevated over them. There were disputes about credit for victories and responsibility for failures. There was an accusation, almost certainly false and almost certainly politically motivated, of an assault on a young girl, which Jones denied absolutely. The accusation was eventually dropped, but the damage to his reputation at the Russian court was severe. He was put on indefinite leave in 1789 and effectively expelled from Russian service, though the formal terms were more polite than that. He returned to Paris, where the French Revolution was now in full eruption. The city around him was transforming into something unrecognizable, something that consumed some of the very people who had honored him. His health was failing. He was suffering from what modern physicians would probably identify as nephritis, a kidney disease that was slowly killing him. He was 45 years old and looked older. He spent his final years in Paris trying to arrange a new commission, writing letters to Thomas Jefferson, who was now Secretary of State and who had always been a supporter of his, attempting to interest the American government in his services for a possible naval mission against the Barbary pirates who were then terrorizing American merchant shipping in the Mediterranean. The commission was actually approved by Congress, but it arrived too late. On July 18, 1792, a Tuesday, John Paul Jones was found kneeling by his bed in his Paris apartment by the friends who came to check on him. He had been alive that morning but was unconscious. He died a short time later. He was 45 years old. He died in a rented apartment in Paris, far from the sea that had made him, far from America that he had helped to create, without enough money to cover the costs of a grand funeral, famous and honored, and still somehow alone in the way that men of his particular intensity of nature are always somehow alone. The story of what happened to his body after his death is one of the more remarkable postscripts in American history. He was buried in Paris, in the St. Louis Cemetery for foreign Protestants in the French capital. And then, as the years passed and the French Revolution gave way to the Napoleonic Wars and the whole shape of the world changed, his grave was essentially forgotten. The cemetery went out of use. Buildings were constructed around and above it. By the middle of the 19th century, no one knew exactly where John Paul Jones was buried. It was not until 1899, more than a century after his death, that the American government decided this was unacceptable. The ambassador to France at the time was General Horace Porter, a Civil War veteran who had served on Ulysses Grant's staff, and Porter became personally obsessed with finding Jones's grave. He spent 6 years and a substantial portion of his own personal fortune researching the original burial records, investigating the area around the old cemetery, and eventually identifying the location where Jones had been interred. In April of 1905, excavations uncovered a lead coffin that had been remarkably well preserved by the dry conditions of the sealed vault in which it lay. The coffin was opened, and what was found inside confirmed the identification. The body inside, preserved with surprising completeness after more than 100 years, matched descriptions of Jones: the short stature, the strong physique, and most convincingly, the careful anatomical comparison with portraits made during his lifetime. President Theodore Roosevelt sent a naval squadron to bring the body home. The Olympia, the flagship that Admiral Dewey had commanded at the Battle of Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War, escorted the coffin across the Atlantic. When it arrived in Annapolis, Maryland, where the United States Naval Academy is located, a ceremony of extraordinary pomp and ceremony was held. The coffin lay in state while thousands of people filed past. Midshipmen stood honor guard. Roosevelt himself attended the ceremony and gave a speech. Jones was reinterred in a crypt beneath the chapel of the Naval Academy, where he rests today in a magnificent bronze and marble sarcophagus modeled on that of Napoleon Bonaparte in Paris. He is surrounded by the institution that in many ways represents his legacy, the Professional Naval Officer Corps of the United States. Every midshipman who has ever passed through those halls, every officer who has ever served in the United States Navy, carries in some sense the inheritance of what John Paul Jones created. He did not just win battles. He established the idea that there could be a distinctly American way of fighting at sea, aggressive and independent, and absolutely unwilling to accept the limitations that circumstances might seem to impose. To truly understand the significance of John Paul Jones, you have to understand the world in which he operated. The 18th century Royal Navy was the most powerful naval force in the history of the world up to that point. It had defeated the Spanish Armada's legacy. It had fought the Dutch through multiple wars. It had defeated the French repeatedly. It was the instrument by which Britain had built the largest empire the world had ever seen. And it was not just militarily powerful. It was psychologically dominant. The red ensign of the Royal Navy was a symbol that made merchants and navvies across the world adjust their plans and their routes and their ambitions in response to what the British might do. Into this world came a Scottish gardener's son with a borrowed surname and a converted merchant ship, and an absolute refusal to accept that the mathematics of the situation meant he was going to lose. He attacked British ports. He fought British warships off the coast of England itself. He captured one of the Royal Navy's new frigates while commanding a vessel that was literally sinking beneath his feet. And he did it in a way that forced the world, including Britain, to acknowledge that something new was happening. America was not just a political experiment in self-governance. It was a force in the world, a force that could project power across oceans. The phrase "I have not yet begun to fight" has become, over the centuries, a shorthand for a particular kind of human quality. It is the quality of refusing to accept the judgment of circumstances. It is the quality of looking at every rational indicator that says you are finished and finding, somewhere in the core of yourself, a reason to keep going. Athletes use it, soldiers use it, entrepreneurs use it, politicians use it. It has become detached from its original context to become a kind of universal statement about resilience and determination. But we owe it to history to remember the context. The man who said those words, or words like them, was a complex human being with a complicated past. He had been part of the slave trade. He had killed at least one man and possibly two in circumstances that were never fully clarified. He had fled from justice by changing his name. He had an ego that created conflicts throughout his career. He could be petty about credit and recognition. He died largely forgotten in a rented apartment in Paris. And yet he was also a man who had come from nothing and built himself into something remarkable. He was a man who genuinely believed in the American experiment, who saw in the ideals of the revolution something worth fighting for with everything he had. He was a tactician of genuine genius, capable of seeing possibilities in desperate situations that other men simply could not perceive. He was a writer of surprising grace and intelligence, whose letters and memoirs reveal a mind that was not just militarily acute, but genuinely thoughtful about the nature of war and honor and duty. He was also, and this is perhaps the most human and touching thing about him, a man who cared deeply about the welfare of the ordinary sailors who served under him. His advocacy for better treatment of naval crews was ahead of his time. He wrote extensively about the need for proper pay and conditions for enlisted men, and he argued this not just on practical grounds, but on moral ones. He believed that men who were treated with respect fought better, but also that men who served deserved to be treated with respect as an end in itself. This was not a common view among naval officers of his era. The legacy of John Paul Jones is therefore not simple, and it should not be made simple. He was a hero, and he was a fugitive. He was a visionary, and he was difficult and sometimes petty. He was a man of remarkable personal courage, and he was a man with genuine moral blind spots. He was the founder of an American naval tradition, and he was a European in many of his tastes and sensibilities and personal connections. He was one of the most internationally famous Americans of his era, and he died alone and nearly forgotten in Paris. History does not give us saints or demons. It gives us human beings, shaped by their times and their experiences and their own particular mixture of gifts and flaws, doing things that sometimes transcend what we think is possible, and sometimes falling short of what we expect from them. John Paul Jones is one of the most vivid examples of this complexity that American history offers. He is worth knowing fully, not just the quote, not just the battle, not just the bronze sarcophagus in the chapel at Annapolis, but the whole man, the child on the Scottish coast watching the ships, the young sailor learning to navigate the Atlantic, the driven and sometimes ruthless captain, the tactical genius who refused to lower his flag, the aging hero dying in a Paris apartment, and the body that traveled across an ocean to come home more than a century after his death. The Battle of Flamborough Head lasted approximately 3.5 hours. In those 3.5 hours, more than 100 men died and hundreds more were wounded. 2 ships were destroyed, 1 sank and 1 was burned later as a prize. A convoy of 41 merchant vessels was captured, and a sentence was spoken, or something like a sentence, that would outlast every ship and every cannon and every uniform and every political argument of that entire war. I have not yet begun to fight. There is something in that sentence that goes beyond military history. There is something in it that speaks to a fundamental human question. What do you do when everything tells you it is over? What do you do when the evidence of your senses and the calculations of reason say that the rational choice is to accept defeat? John Paul Jones, in that moment, gave one answer, and it is an answer that continues to resonate because the question itself never becomes obsolete. The sea that he watched from that stone cottage in Kirkby never changed. It is still there. The Solway Firth still moves with tides that predate any human ambition and will outlast any human achievement. The waters off Flamborough Head, where he fought his greatest battle, are still cold and gray and indifferent to the drama that played out on their surface more than 2 centuries ago. The ocean does not remember John Paul Jones any more than it remembered any of the 10,000 other human beings who have fought and died on its surface across the centuries. But we remember. We remember because his story tells us something we need to hear, something about what is possible when a human being refuses to accept the verdict that circumstances have handed down. We remember because the country he helped create is still fighting over the questions he raised, about what it means to project power, about what honor in warfare requires, about the relationship between the ideals a nation professes and the methods it uses to defend them. We remember because the institution he helped inspire, the United States Navy, is still the most powerful naval force in the history of the world, still carrying in its traditions and its culture the echo of what one man with one ship did off the coast of England in the autumn of 1779. And we remember because the quote itself, whatever the exact words were, however imperfect the circumstances of its recording, captures something true. Not true about naval warfare specifically, but true about what it is to be human, with all the vulnerability and the stubborn refusal to accept vulnerability that involves. John Paul Jones did not know, in that moment, that he was going to win. He did not have information that the balance of the battle was about to shift. He simply decided, in the most literal sense of that word, that he was not done, that there was more to be said. That the fight, the fight of this strange, improbable navy of a strange, improbable nation, had not yet truly begun. He was right. And we are still living in the world that his refusal to quit helped to make. The story of America is not the story of a nation that was handed its place in the world. It is the story of a nation that fought for it, often against odds that looked impossible, often with resources that were inadequate, often in ways that were improvised and imperfect, but driven by something that went beyond calculation. John Paul Jones is perhaps the purest embodiment of that story in the first generation of American history. He is the proof, written in fire and iron and the cold water of the North Sea, that the outcome of a battle, like the outcome of a life, is not always determined by who starts with the most advantages. Sometimes it is determined by who refuses, at the critical moment, to accept that it is over. Sometimes it is determined by one voice, cutting through the smoke and the noise and the chaos, saying something that no one in that moment expects to hear. Sometimes it is determined by the absolute, irrational, magnificent refusal to begin what has not yet even truly started. I have not yet begun to fight, and neither perhaps have you.